Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our fourth talk this week on various aspects of London history that have come out of our collections at Guildhall Library. So I've been telling you stories about material that we have in the library, and as I said, if you've been to some of the previous talks, sometimes I'm an expert on the subject and sometimes I'm not. I'm not necessarily an expert on this particular subject, but I'll tell you how it came about. About 5 years ago, somebody handed in, they'd been looking at a magazine, a Victorian magazine, which they handed back to us to send back to our stores. And I'd never seen it before, and I opened it up, and I just thought, this is really interesting. It's something that I thought the library wouldn't sort of really have. I wanted to know why we'd acquired it, and something about the history of those particular publications. So I'm going to tell you something about the history of those sorts of publications. I hope it won't shock you in any way. I'll tell you if I'm going to show you an image that might shock you. But on the whole, it should be quite tame. Okay. At the end, if you haven't been to previous talks, we've got a draw to win a book, and also on your way out there will be a cupcake on the exit for you to take. So let's go on with today's topic, which is under-the-counter landsmags. And landsmags clearly weren't called that in Victorian London, but I think that gives a good idea of the sort of thing we're going to be talking about in Victorian London. So, this is my warning to you. You probably have to be over 16 in order to watch this presentation. So this is my certificate from the film censors. Right, so imagine we're in London in the 1830s, 40s, 50s. So very early Victorian London. And you were a gentleman, inverted commas, who wanted to acquire something a bit saucy. You wouldn't then go to Hatchard's on Piccadilly to buy it. You would go to a number of different areas, and the most notorious area to buy that sort of magazine is the area around Holywell Street and Wych Street. And those two streets no longer exist. They have disappeared under Bush House and the Aldwych. That's where they were. Wych Street and Aldwych refer to the Saxon history of the city. Completely demolished, and I'll come back to that right at the end of the talk. So this is the entrance to both Wych Street and Holywell Street down here. It was occupied by booksellers, by pubs, and by sort of low-class theatres as well. As you can see, and I'll come back to this, lots of the building is quite ancient, and that will be probably one of the reasons that the booksellers set up in that area. So Wych Street and Holywell Street. This is where they were. This is the Strand, and this is St Clement Danes, which is still sitting in the middle of the road. And the two streets run up here, forming a sort of triangular block. They were very narrow streets, and in fact, for a time in the 19th century, they worked as one-way streets. And so those are the places you would go to buy a rather saucy magazine. This is what they look like. The streets survived to be photographed at the end of the 19th century. And had they survived a bit longer, they might have actually been preserved altogether. There was a campaign to preserve them, because the streets were made up of Tudor Elizabethan buildings, quite a lot of them, which had basically survived the Great Fire of London because it hadn't spread this far. And by the end of the 19th century, were very decayed and decrepit. So the Victorians clearly wanted to clear out most of the areas that had that sort of building, and the campaign to preserve ancient buildings hadn't really got going. It actually got going in relation to this and in relation to other buildings, for instance, up Cloth Fair. So this is a view down Holywell Street. And this is what a letter to the Times said about the area. So it said, somebody wrote, I would like to direct your attention more especially to Holywell Street and Wych Street, in which our shops, the windows of which display books and pictures of the most disgusting and obscene character, and which are alike loathsome to the eye and offensive to the morals of any person of well-regulated mind. The mischief, however, does not exist merely in the outward display alone. That is perhaps the least part of the danger, but alas, that is nothing to the effect that such works are calculated to produce from the minds of those persons whose morbid desires induce them eagerly to peruse them, oftentimes to the destruction of their health, and, what is infinitely worse, to their soul's danger. So that's a typical letter to the Times. Today you still get letters to the Times, right? But clearly that area was notorious. People knew that that's what the area specialised in. This is what somebody else said. This is a modern person, right? I just really like this. Volleyball Street sat like a great dark spider at the centre of a web of obscenity. It generated obscene publications, displayed and advertised them, and sold them onto other sellers and hawkers. That's quite interesting because not only was it the centre of somewhere where you could buy this sort of literature, it's where booksellers could go and buy it, put in their own shops in other areas of London, and there were other areas where you could buy this sort of material. In Southwark, you can guess the areas really. Southwark, around Mile End, in the East End, so those are the sorts of places. This was probably the most popular area because it was between the city and Westminster, so it was quite close to the businessmen in the city, people working in the Houses of Parliament possibly might want to pop along and buy something from those sorts of shops. This is a watercolour from the 19th century, and people were recognising that the area had some charm other than its bookshops, and started to draw and paint it, because some people realised that these were important buildings that were probably going to be lost, the last surviving buildings of a pre-fire London. And what is interesting about the area is the fact that those buildings were old, as I say, Tudor and Elizabethan and early 17th century. So on the left is Wych Street, I think that's Wych Street. On the right is Soho. So we know that in the 20th century, Soho still has a bit of a reputation for sex shops and for publications, pornographic publications. And it's interesting that in the 19th century, they occupied an area that had old buildings, and in the 20th century, Soho is mostly made up of 17th, 18th century buildings. And the reason they're occupying those areas is because the buildings are run down, they're cheap for people to hire out as shops. So that's probably why in Victorian times they were centring around those old buildings, because they could afford to pay the rents on the run-down buildings. Okay, so this is my first warning to you. So warning, you're about to see the front cover of a shockingly obscene The Town. Some ladies and gentlemen might not look away now or have ready bottles manacles. The Town is the journal I'm going to be talking about, because it's the one we've got the best run of in the library. So here we go. This is The Town. I'll just show you what size it is, because I've got a copy here. We've just been doing some conservation work on these. So that's the size of The Town. So it's a bit like the Daily Mail size, really, I suppose. We've been doing some conservation work because they're very rare. So we might have a first folio, which we display down there, but The Town is probably much rarer than the first folio because people didn't keep them. They read them, hid them from their wives, and then threw them away. So they don't survive very much. So we're making sure we look after our copies of The Town. So this is the front page. It was produced in the late 1830s and the early 1840s, and it was aimed at the same group of people, basically, who read those lads' mags today. So at the top, you can see that there's sort of scenes in London, and it's very much a London paper, and those images reflect back to the 1820s, when Life in London was produced. I don't know if you've heard of Life in London by Piers Egan, which was stories of two blokes that went around town getting up to no good. It was very fashionable. Two usually well-off men getting up to no good, pushing over the policemen in the street, going to see going gambling, going to balls, that sort of thing. So that top there is very much like getting up to no good in London town in the 1820s. So what did this journal contain? This is what the novelist Thackeray described the town. And Thackeray was a complete and utter snob. So he wrote about lots of these sorts of journals. So he must have looked at them, but he always then complained about how terrible they were. So he says, the main point of these papers seems to be a wish to familiarise every man in London who can afford a penny, and pennies are very cheap even in Victorian times, with the doings of the gin shops, the gambling houses, and the houses more infamous still. The popularity of the journals and their contents are dismal indications indeed of the social condition of the purchasers, who are found among the lower classes in London. Thanks to the enlightened spirit of the age, no man scarcely is so ill-educated not to be able to read them. So he doesn't even approve of teaching people to read, really. But certainly not the poorer classes. And blessings on cheap literature. No man is too poor to buy them. The town forms the délice of the servant maid who grins over the precious page along with the sly John Footman, the test book of the apprentice who doles it out to his comrades, the hidden treasure of the charmed schoolboy, who by this excellent medium knows as much about the town as the oldest rake in it. So what he's saying is, he doesn't like the fact that the working classes are reading something, like servants and the apprentices. Like he was a complete utter snob, a good novelist, but a snob generally. But if you imagine this is the 1830s and 1840s, and we usually think of the Victorians as being very prim and proper, this must have been quite shocking to somebody like Thackeray to have this sort of picture in a journal like The Town, which anybody could go and buy in Wych Street or Holywell Street. So the pictures I'm going to show you are all taken from The Town. Interestingly, when The Town started, it had quite a good run, and then it changed its name very briefly for 2 issues, then it went back to The Town, then it disappeared, then it started publishing again. When it started publishing again, it was much less saucy. The pictures were much tamer, so these are from the early issues of The Town. So what does The Town contain? It contains stories. There's always a running story, and it contains advertisements, which we'll come to in a moment, a number of stories, and there's always an illustration. And you can start to see some of the things that might titillate to the Victorians. So this illustration, you can see what's happening here is the woman is swapping clothes with the man. This is a man here, you can see by his boots here. So already, it's shocking to a Victorian that a woman is wearing trousers and that a man should be dressing as a woman. And you will see that there are certain things that clearly shock people, but then would titillate a certain class of society in Victorian London. There is a running story about Mrs. Lorimer Spinks. She pretends to be an innocent, but she gets herself into dreadful situations. And it's a bit like that phrase, and then all my clothes fell off. Basically, she gets into a situation, and I think the significant thing is she's Mrs., therefore she's an experienced woman. It's also probably more titillating or shocking to the Victorians that she is a married woman. But she goes through endless adventures where various men chase her around, and she can't resist these men. So Mrs. Lorimer Spinks is one of the heroines of the story. So this is just a snippet of one of the stories. Mrs. Spinks had removed the whole of her daily apparel. She's always taking her clothes off, and was in the act of putting on her night jacket when her eye fell upon a large blue cloak in the corner of the room. A sudden thought seemed to strike her. She advanced towards it, and taking it in her hand, she at once perceived marked beneath the collar the name Gascoigne. "Great God!" she ejaculated, it is he." And the next instant she would have fallen to the ground when she felt her waist encircled by an arm, and the soft but manly voice whispered in tones of the sweetest endearment, "Yes, Margaret, 'tis indeed he who has followed you, a cruel woman through every danger." Mrs. Spinks gazed with a look of unutterable despair at the figure which now firmly clasped her in his arms. It was a man of singularly handsome exterior, about 25 years of age, attired in a morning wrapper, it's a bit like a dressing gown, I think, and appeared to have just risen from his bed. For a moment, speech seemed to have entirely left her. "Lovely woman," continued the stranger, clasping her still further in his arms. "You are at length mine. Edward, Edward!" And she knows who he is, clearly. At length, exclaimed Mrs. Spinks, "Release me and fly from this spot instantly. In a few moments, my husband will return, and were you found here, I should be ruined forever." And if you've read what's going on before, she's ruined already. What madness could have indeed induced you to take up your residence here? So there she is, in a perilous position, Mrs. Spinks. And then it goes on, "And can you think to ask that question?" answered her companion. "Yeah, you who have so often professed to love me, but no matter, I have not come here unprepared." And withdrawing his gown, the light fell upon his long dagger. "Come what may, you must be mine. Edward," she continued, "what would you do? It is my eternal ruin that you seek." The young stranger made no answer. Her struggles to release herself, though the trifle had removed a considerable portion even of the slight drapery that had covered her person, so all her clothes fell off. The snowy whiteness of her neck and the rich contour of her waist, even to the delicate veins that encircled her bosom, were all laid bare to his view. Again he essayed to speak, but his arms only pressed her more firmly into his embrace, whilst at every attempt made by her remonstrance, her mouth was closed by kisses as warm as they were continuous. At this moment, a noise was heard upon the parapet. It was the sound of footsteps evidently advancing towards the window. They drew nearer. The next instant, Edward had extinguished the lamp, and almost immediately the light of the moon fell upon the figure of a man who passed the casement, followed by the sound of the opening and closing of an adjoining window. "Who can it be?" said Mrs. Spinks. And they make a flight over the roof. I won't tell you what happens next, but quite often it ends with ... And you have to go to the next episode, and quite often it's jumped what you think might have happened, and it starts a whole new episode. So it's tantalising you to buy the next issue. So if you want to find out, you have to come to Guildhall Library and read what happens next to Mrs. Spinks. So what else does the journal contain? Well, it contains reviews of brothels, which is quite extraordinary at this time. It contains pictures that show the interior of brothels. It only does this early on in its publication. Later it seems to have dropped this reviews of brothels, but clearly this is a picture inside a brothel, and probably the most shocking thing to Victorian is a woman smoking a cigar and exposing her ankles, as you can see here. It reviews individual prostitutes. This is a sort of comic view of prostitutes, but it does actually review prostitutes in a sort of condemning way. It says, whatever you do, don't go to Mrs. Watson's house on 17 Bruton Street. Actually, that's where the Queen was born. In a street in London, because you will find shocking things like Annie, who will do this, and whatever. So it's basically saying, don't ever go there, but also don't go next door, we can also get something else. So this is a sort of comic view of West End and East End prostitutes. But it does take the subject quite seriously, and it's very quite comic about it. And it does this. You start thinking it's this about a gherkin shop, and then if you read it, you realise it's not necessarily like that. So think not, you were jesting, gentle, or rather genteel reader of the town, for we are writing in positive, sober seriousness. Number 12 Bridges Street is open for the vending of pickles and fruit. Gherkins being in the ascendant, hint hint. We found that the house was kept by our good friend Madam B, formerly of Charles Street Pickle Depot, assisted by one or two fair demoiselles who, Eve-like, endeavour to tempt the passer-by to drop them and taste their fruit. We also like one more, actually. So you clearly realise they're not talking about pickles whatsoever. And it's also saying, you know, it's hiding what it's talking about in this case. It's being a bit coy about it. And then you have images like this. And I don't need to explain this image, but as you can see, there's a reference to a sword, and she looks like she's pulling something, opening a bottle or something. There's always a reference like, it's well up, sir. So these images don't necessarily refer to any other text. They're like cartoons, they're saucy cartoons. Here's another one. There's a balloon in the background, but he's waiting for an ascent, and she's showing her ankles. It's often they show a rather an elderly man or a sort of ugly man and a beautiful woman. They like to see them contrast those images together. They also say if you have difficulty getting the magazine, then persons finding it difficulty in obtaining the town at the East End of London can be supplied from Caffin and Oxford Street, Mile End, or Cole at Bedford Street, Commercial Road East, and Reynolds and 25 Church Road, St George's in the East, where a good stock of back novels is kept at hand. So you can see that's the sort of area you could go to acquire those journals. Rather run-down areas, poorer areas of London. Again, images of women smoking, exposing their legs, drinking. This would have been shocking to a certain section of Victorian society. But also the advertisements are what, in some ways, are the most interesting. So you might be able to buy the town over the counter, but if you want something a bit harder, then you had to send off for it. So you can see this is an advert in the town saying you can get the beauties de la nature for splendid engravings for 5 shillings and 6pence. That's very expensive. Often these saucy images you could send off for were referred to in the French or as French pictures. So the philosophy of pleasure, 8 spicy plates à la française for 1 shilling, something called Spice Nuts, The Beauty of Woman, Pretty Girls of London, a bachelor's album, sealed gems. So these were literally under-the-counter magazines or things you had to send off for. I'm sure if you went into one of those shops where you could buy the town in Wych Street, you could probably say, have you got anything else? And you'd bring out something from underneath the counter. So more images, a scene at a bal masque. So you can see that it's being coy and being quite sort of obscene in some ways by juxtaposing parts of the body. I shall stop describing it there. Here's Mrs. Finch. She continues her exploits, and as you can see, the policemen are coming to her rescue, but of course all her clothes fall off whenever anybody appears. She's quite, you know, she's sort of, it's interesting that she's the centre of the story, and the story's about Mrs. Finch rather than about the men. So she's the heroine of her own story. And you can see some of the pictures are quite daring, and you can see that. What do you think of this, Susan? Why I think I like Charlie's Machine better than the open air. So it's just an excuse to show semi-naked women and make an obscene reference. So the journal this is when it changed its name briefly to London Life. And it may be that they were about to be prosecuted. And booksellers in Wych Street and Holywell Street were often prosecuted. They often appeared in the papers, prosecuted for selling obscene literature. So perhaps the owners of the town didn't want to be prosecuted, so they changed its name and issued it that week under a different name. It very quickly goes back to its original name. So at the top, what it also reviewed and advertised were things that took place at music halls, at some theatrical dives south of the river, where they would put on performances that might be slightly saucy, related to things in the journal, things that would not be put on in the West End. So at the Surrey Music Hall, for instance, various music halls, mostly in South London, certainly outside the borders of the city and out of the West End. So it'd be reviewing and advertising things like that instead of warbling and whacking up. And we also had adverts like this. So private, important, practical hints on all secret diseases, degenerative weakness, nervous disability. So basically advertising things to deal with sexually transmitted diseases. Down the bottom, gonorrhea, perfect cure within a week, medicine sent to all parts daily. So it was for gentlemen to be discreet about getting medicines for some illness they might have. Written and published proprietors W. in Holywell Street, Strand. All communications can be addressed. I quite like this one. Don't jam the grass is down. I just like that one, so I just put that one in. Before I go on to that, what I haven't got a picture of is there are replies to correspondence. So you see that in lots of journals today where they give a reply to a correspondent. What you don't get is the question. So you have to work out from the reply to the correspondent what the person's asked them about. And some replies are things like, whatever I would do, I'd stop what you're doing now. Or if I were you, I'd ask her, to marry you. But often you just have to work out what the question is. I think there probably weren't any questions at all. They've just made up a load of answers, and then you have to use your mind to work out what the question was. They're very entertaining, actually. They're worth looking at those. What also relates to these sort of gentlemen's magazines are things called Bloods or Penny Dreadfuls. And these are things that were aimed at young schoolboys, young men. They were exciting stories, but they were very disapproved of. And what was interesting is that you could buy this sort of material, and it was often published in Wych Street and Holywell Street. You'll find that lots of these publishers have their shops or their printing presses in those streets. So what people disapproved of is that a young schoolboy might go to buy Black Bess or The Knight of the Road, which is one of the longest novels ever written in the English language, which went on forever and ever into about 254 parts. While they were buying that, they might be seeing other things in the shops. That's what the Victorians disapproved of, that the shops were selling things to boys and things to men as well. But this was the sort of thing that they bought. They were mostly criminal stories, also stories of people just getting up to no good, playing tricks on other people. These are some of the most famous. And Spring Hill Jack, the popularity of Spring Hill Jack comes out of these Penny Dreadfuls and Bloods at the time. The Wild Boys of London ran and changed title. Some of these people were prosecuted too. They just set up again under a different name and started publishing things under a different name. These, again, are exceptionally rare nowadays. There are a few collectors in the world. We do have some here at Guildhall Library. material, mostly relating to London. And I should say, why have we got the town here? We've got the town, I've no idea when we acquired it, and its condition is not brilliant, that's why we're getting it sorted out. We acquire everything to do with the history of London, and so we don't really make a quality decision about that material. We think that something like the town is just as important in the history of London as any of these Shakespeare things that we've got on display here, or anything else about it. We have Thackeray material here. We wouldn't get the town just because Thackeray disapproved of it. So we try to get a cross-section of the whole of London history. So although the Victorians might have disapproved of it, that's important in the history of London. That's why we have it here. Now just to say something about the end of that area. So clearly it had a terrible reputation. There was a campaign to have it sorted out, and in fact that campaign did clear out a lot of the booksellers. But it also meant that people just didn't move into the shops, they became empty, the pubs were run down, the houses turned into houses of multiple occupation. And in the end, the Victorians decided to sweep away the whole lot. So it was demolished between the very late 1890s and about 1904. And as I said, because people had taken interest in the history of the area, they photographed its demolition as well as when it was standing. So there's some wonderful photographs at London Metropolitan Archives of its demolition. And this is what replaced it. So there's Wych Street and Holywell Street down here. So if you want to find out where it was, you just need to walk down Kingsway, and this is the Aldwych in the Strand, which is completely obliterated. It's interesting that the BBC in Bushire sat directly on where all the pornography was created in Wych Street. And that is the end of Lads Magazine Victorian London.